Hello and welcome to Farscape's webinar, The Science Behind Learning in the Outdoors. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you find today's webinar useful. Just a couple of points of admin. We're aiming to have the webinar running for an hour, and we'll probably be presenting for somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes. Conscious that it's very difficult for people to stay engaged for any longer than about half an hour online. So actually we're going to try and keep the pace as fast as possible whilst not skipping over any of the detail that we want to share with you. So before I begin, also just a quick word about questions. Thank you to all of you who have submitted questions in advance of the webinar today. And we have got those and have considered those in designing the content. If there are any questions that come up for you during the course of the webinar, please do post them. You'll see that there's a box down on the right-hand side of your panel that you can post a question in, which will then pop up for us. And we'll make sure that we address those probably at the end of the webinar, just so that we can see whether we already cover the answers during the content. So to start off with then, my name's Ruth Moody. As you can see on the screen, there's a picture of myself and Neil who'll be presenting today. I'm the Managing Director here at Farscape Development. This is a subject that is of real interest to me and something that I have had a real passion for many years. I've recently completed my postgraduate certificate in international field leadership with a particular focus on looking at how the environment impacts on people's learning, and particularly how you can use the outdoor environment to great effect to help people learn and grow. My colleague Neil Kimberley is our commercial director here at Farscape, and he also has got many years' experience of working with people in an outdoor environment to help them with their development. Neil's just completed his master's at Henley Business School in coaching and behavioural change, and his thesis was focused on the impact of the environment when coaching. So he's got a lot of experience to share and has done a lot of research into this subject. In addition to that, together we've led recently an expedition to Morocco, which was designed as a research expedition to look at how we could take leaders into an outdoor environment to help them with their learning. And we'll be touching upon some examples from that as we go through. Before we get going with the full content of the webinar, though, I'd like to hand over to Neil to give some background and context about our thinking behind this big topic. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth, and morning everyone, and welcome to the webinar. The recent survey that came out in May this year, I'm sure many of you will have looked at, and if you haven't, I definitely recommend you go and have a look at it. I'm just going to pull out a handful of sort of pertinent points around this topic, although it is a very lengthy report. So say if you haven't read it, do go and have a look at some really useful stats and evidence in there that you can use for part of justifying the programs that you're pulling together in your organisations. I mean, one of the key things that came out for me is that a lot of L&D departments now are very much focusing on positioning themselves where they're all about personal and organisational performance. And trying to move away from that old school feel of L&D being about simply delivering training. So it's that focus on personal and organisation performance, which is really all around the development of people's conscious awareness and developing a learning culture in an organisation. I think the second thing that comes out of the survey that's very key as well is the struggle that many L&D leaders are finding in aligning their own personal L&D strategy for the business alongside the wider business goals and strategic strategy for the wider business, and getting the two aligned. And a lot of that comes down to often them reporting back that they experience barriers through poor perceptions of L&D by senior management in the organisation. And I think that's one thing we can return to in this webinar as to how potentially the outdoors can help that process. There's a great section in there about the current trends in delivery from L&D departments in organisations, which does depend on the size of the organisation, but a lot of that is around there's a lot of writing throughout the L&D community around the 70-20-10 ratio for delivery, where the 70 is about learning on the job, and there's certainly a definite rise of that. It's often led by lack of resources, but also good results in some cases. The 20 being about learning from colleagues and peers, whether that's through in-house coaching programs, creating coaching cultures and mentoring schemes. And also then the 10 in the ratio being the more formal training and external provision. So I guess that's where some of this outdoor learning could be if you don't have the capability in-house. But I think one of the things we want to cover today is actually how you can build the use of the outdoor and natural environment into that 70 and 20 part of the ratio. Another key sort of insight in from the report was around the sort of the continuing struggle that L&D leaders have around evaluation, especially of the development programs that are very behaviourally focused. How do you measure it beforehand? What's the status quo when the delegates start, and how do you measure it at the end? And making those behaviours stick long term. So I think one of the things we want to try and look at today is how, by weaving the outdoor and natural environment into some of your development programs, especially at senior level, it's more likely that those behaviours are going to stick. If the behaviours stick, it's the senior people that widely are known to sort of generate the culture in the business, and that sort of hopefully gets around that sort of catch-22 scenario of if the reason why the L&D has got a poor perception of the business is because the senior leaders don't understand it properly, that might be down to their own experience of L&D programs. So if you can design senior programs that have that big impact, both behaviourally and developmentally, then they're more likely then to have those personal experiences that help them buy into the value of L&D for the wider business. And then the final thing just there is that 80% of the people that took part in the survey said that they're likely to engage in some sort of leadership development programming over the next 12 months. So again, one of the things we want to try and touch on today is how practical it is in a corporate environment to try and weave the natural environment and outdoor learning environment into your development programs. The second bullet point there, looking at evidence from other fields of education and learning. The outdoor industry has been obviously using the outdoors for a long time now. But interestingly, as I'll come on to in the third point in a moment, is that's tended to get from a corporate perspective, developed quite negative perceptions over the years, and I'll come to that in a moment. But whilst the corporate environment has sort of moved away from the outdoors in probably the last sort of 10-15 years and sort of shunned it to some extent, actually the amount of study and research that has been going on in the outdoor industry, both here in the UK, especially through the Institute for Outdoor Learning, there's a whole raft of psychological study that has gone on around reflective practice and the benefits of personal development in an outdoor environment. So we'll touch on that as well. There's obviously the rise of neuroscience. There's a lot that's written and spoken about now about neuroscience, and what we'll try, it's a huge field, so what we'll try and focus on today is simply the areas of neuroscience that have got some research and empirical study behind them that back up the sorts of psychological development you can do in an outdoor environment and the benefits of that. I think one thing that we've lost sight of in L&D as well is over the years is that in education, the use of the outdoors has continued and has some really fantastic studies from looking in more depth at experiential learning for young people and how that enhances their thinking and creativity skills, through to the sort of more practical level of school and classroom design and all the sort of strides and advances that have taken place there that have been largely not acknowledged in the corporate sector and haven't moved across to sort of influence the design of our corporate learning spaces. And then just the general sort of theory around creating a learning environment. And if you're focusing on that more behavioural developmental learning, how do you create those environments that really help people to go on that developmental journey? There's lots, again, in education as well. There's been a huge push over the last probably sort of 8 to 10 years through the government, the education department, to learning outside the classroom, and that agenda, which has got a great swell of movement across the country. And alongside that, forest schools, a huge number of schools now, especially in the primary sector, seeing the value of actually using the outdoor environment as a classroom for the rest of the wider curriculum. And I think it's the positive impact that all of those things have on learning and behaviours that we're trying to sort of pull together and sort of synthesize today to give you an overview of the stuff that you could go away and look at in much more detail, because they are big subjects. The third thing there on the on the slide there. Ruth, if you could click onto the next one. Is this thing about the negative perceptions of outdoor education, as it were, and does it have a genuine, serious role in corporate learning and development? And I'm sure, you know, just look at the sample of photographs there, and from your own anecdotal feedback from colleagues, peers, your own experiences, I'm sure you'll have examples of where the outdoors probably didn't have a positive impact on a program and may well have had a negative impact. So you can see some of the, you know, the standard trust games there, you know, sending people up high ropes, getting people wet and muddy for the sake of it, you know, building rafts, which in their own right are all fantastic activities. Whether they generate fear or fun will depend on the individual. And also the learning that then comes out of them, whether individually or as a group, largely depends on the quality of the facilitation. And I think where a lot of these negative perceptions came from historically back in the 80s and the 90s was that the growth of the outdoor industry was largely driven by providers and practitioners who were very focused on the hard skills, came from climate backgrounds, canoeing, mountaineering, and so on, and were probably less skilled in the psychological understanding of how people develop and how their emotions and behaviours impact on their learning. And I think that negative perception then sort of almost relegated the outdoor industry to the team away day, fun activities, team building, selection programs for graduates, all that sort of thing, and less about sort of senior leadership development. So I think that's one of the things that for us, there's so much research that has continued since that time that gives all that psychological underpinning to the value of the outdoors, that we want to try and highlight some of that today to show you that it is possible to break some of these negative perceptions that exist out there. And then finally, the sort of last point that I wanted to come back to then was some of our recent research. I mean, Ruth mentioned my own MSc. What really interested me was, having come from a sort of an outdoor background, I was really interested in the lack of discussion around the environment going through my training to become a coach on my own masters. And so that's what led to my own thesis, exploring with some very experienced coaches their use of the environment, the amount of thought they put into that process, and the impact it has on the quality of their coaching interactions. And certainly the coaching and walking area was something that I explored and found that there's very, very little written in the literature, both in L&D and coaching, about the value of that and the benefits. So that's something we'll touch on today. Ruth mentioned our Morocco leadership experience, and we're going to go in that in more depth. But again, it was for us trying to create some genuine research around the benefits of that. And you'll see when we talk about that later, the quality and the senior level of the people that went on the program and their feedback certainly went way beyond the sort of testimonials we were expecting and the evidence that shows it had a good impact. And then finally, for us, it's about a final bit of research and thing that we're pulling together is a white paper that we'll be publishing in a couple of weeks' time, looking at the impact of place and environment and how that acts as the glue on development programs. If you really want to raise leaders' conscious awareness about their personality, their emotional awareness and literacy, and raising their beliefs, looking at them, helping them to explore their beliefs, values, and biases, and also then creating genuine experiential learning and enabling them to develop a reflective practice, then it's place that has the role in sort of anchoring all that learning and trying to overcome that problem, like on most development programs, where people have the insight while they're there, but very quickly it's lost and the learning doesn't stick in terms of the lasting behavioural changes. So hopefully that's one thing that we'll come on to as we go through the webinar. So that's just to set the whole thing in some context and why we're interested in it. And just to sort of echo Ruth's point before, I mean, between us we've probably got about 35 years of experience of working with young people and adults in the outdoor environment, and some real solid examples of the impact that it can have. And I know that's some of the questions that some of you have asked prior to the webinar, is what evidence is that this genuinely has a lasting effect. So we'll touch on that as we go through the rest of the webinar. Okay, well, we'll move on then and get into the sort of meat of the content now, and so I'll hand back over to you, Ruth.
Great, thanks, Neil. So before I then start talking about some of the main theories and introducing some of that kind of thinking behind this, I just want to talk a little bit about what the key learning is going to be from this webinar, what we hope that you're going to be able to take away from it. So first of all, for us, it's really important about thinking through when you're identifying a venue for development programs, what to look for, what to be aware of. So we'll give you some tips around how to do that effectively. And then also to consider when designing your outdoor development programs, what kind of things should you be taking into consideration? How can you make sure that you use that environment and design the program in the best possible ways to deliver the outcomes that you need? So we'll be challenging your thinking a little bit around design and delivery. And then also just touching upon the point that Neil made, how outdoor environments really support the development of consciousness and reflection. And we see those three areas very much as going hand in hand, that if we're able to raise people's consciousness, the way we're going to do that is by helping them to reflect deeply. And actually the place that they do that in is critical to how well they're able to do it. So those are going to be some of the key learnings that we're aiming to deliver as we go through this webinar. So in terms of some of the theories and things that we're going to be covering, what we've aimed to do is to draw together some of the key theories and practices that we feel are particularly useful and relevant, and to share with you how each of these theories contributes to our thinking around effectively using the outdoors for learning. So as a starting point, we're going to be looking at Alan Watkins' work around coherent leadership. And essentially this recognises that we can't just address behaviour to improve performance. We have to look deeper than that, starting with our physiology. Then building on this, we're going to take a look at the neuroscience that Neil's touched upon already. So what goes on chemically for people when they have a developmental experience, and how does the outdoors impact on that for different people? And this links really closely to comfort zones and how we create environments of psychological safety. Moving on from there, we'd then like to look at some research that's specific to the outdoor environment. And some of you may have heard of Stephen Kaplan's attention restoration theory. And we'll be looking at actually what role does the environment itself play in people's development. And then the final area of exploration is going to be around the most effective approach to designing programs in the outdoors, and particularly looking at problem solving and levels of complexity. To bring all of this to life, we're then going to be looking at a couple of examples of how we've brought this together in our own design and delivery, one with a senior leadership program that we've run recently based in the UK, and the other just touching upon some of the evidence that we found from the expedition to Morocco that we've mentioned earlier on. And finally, we'll finish off with some top tips for you to take away when you're considering how you go about designing a development program using the outdoors, or even if you're not going to be able to use the outdoors, really thinking about the place that you're in and what impacts that's going to have. So Neil, I'm going to pass back to you now just to look at the difference between learning and development.
Thanks, Ruth. So in the model, the coherent leadership model that Ruth mentioned there, which is explained in way more depth and more cover today in the book Coherence, which is by Alan Watkins, which came out last year and which will be on the reading list at the end. And I think the interesting thing that sort of comes to light very early on in that model is about what is the difference between learning and development. And if this is the field that we're all working in and the departments that some of you out there are heads of, how clear are we ourselves, and how much clarity have we got in being able to articulate to our senior leaders the difference between the two, and the sorts of programs that we're designing and how we differentiate between learning and development. And in the book Coherence, Alan mentions an article that was from the Harvard Business Review from a guy called Keegan in 2009, who talks about a great analogy that really sort of works for me, that I think really illustrates the difference between the two. And the first bit of that is then if that learning is very much horizontal development. And if I can get you to click the first sort of image up. So learning is very much about filling up the glass. So the programs that a lot of the leadership programs that we'll often be running very much focus on the L. There's a lot of L, learning, and very much less on the D. And so what are we talking about when we say horizontal development? This is about programs that have a high degree of content, whether that's technical, corporate finance, strategy, all those sorts of things, which is raising people's knowledge, topping up their knowledge levels. Or it's programs that are just opening them to experiences of other people, things that they've learned along the way and lessons to be learned. or from their own experiences, or it's about giving them new skills, again, be that technical or behavioural skills. So that's very much at a horizontal level, and I think, you know, as people get to senior level, through their age and, you know, degrees of, you know, intellect, they're very capable of taking on more and more of that knowledge, experience, and skill. So we're just constantly filling up the glass to the point where it's probably overflowing, that knowledge and is going away, skills fade, and so on. So if we really want to focus on development, what we really need to be focused on then, Ruth, if you can click on the next one, is development is about making the glass bigger. This is about creating real sort of vertical development, as Alan Watkins describes it in his coherent leadership model. So this is very much about adult development, the idea being that throughout sort of you know, our early years, there are significant developmental stages that we go through, probably up until around the age 14. Beyond that point, there are no natural big developmental shifts that happen in humans. So what we need to be doing as L&D leaders, and when we're designing our programs, especially at senior level, when we're focusing on behaviours and driving cultural change, is looking at this vertical development. How can we make their glass bigger? So not just topping up knowledge, experience, and skills, but helping them to explore their behaviours, raising their conscious awareness, understanding, you know, emotional intelligence, helping them to develop their breadth of emotional literacy, exploring the notion of personality, whether that's type or trait, and really getting into that in a deep way. And by doing that, then we can give, you know, we're developing leaders that have got a much broader, deeper perspective on who they are and the impact that they have on the organisation, which also then allows them to be much more creative, innovative, helps them find ways of creating much more complex solutions to the problems that, you know, are going to present the business in the future, and creating that environment for the rest of the people in the organisation. So I think the thing for us really is about, if we want to focus on this development more than the learning, to be able to get into that deeper perspective, we really need to create those safer psychological environments where the leaders are willing to explore at that level, which isn't often the case in many organisations, and we'll come on to that a bit later on when we're talking about sort of the sort of safe brain, threat brain, and how that sort of social threat limits people's thinking and willingness to be open and create that trusting and open learning environment. So that's the sort of just a quick sort of heads up on the difference between how we see the difference in the learning and development. The second part of the key thing that comes out of his book that works for us specifically when we're looking at designing programs in the outdoors is this integrated performance model. And if you take my very bad diagram here as being an iceberg, the two bits at the top that are above the surface is largely where a lot of the developmental work that does happen tends to focus. It's, you know, a needs analysis will have been done, identifying that the results and targets aren't being achieved, and that's because of the behaviours in the organisation, which, again, widely recognised that's driven by the top tiers in the organisation. But if you want to change those behaviours, what a lot of development programs don't then look at is what is it that's driving those behaviours. And where Alan Watkins' model comes in there is that we need to look in much more detail. So he goes into talking about the physiology, and again, we'll give you the reference so you could go away and look at this in more detail, and how the physiology then impacts on people and drives and generates the emotions that are going on in the body. And then it's only then if people are aware of that process and can actually notice the emotions that they then understand the feelings, and having a proper understanding that the feelings then impact on their thinking and their cognitive processing. And only if you can get leaders really engaging at that emotional level, thinking about how their feelings impact on their cognitive processing, are you able then to genuinely hone in on their behaviours in a way that will generate lasting behavioural change and making it stick. Getting away from that issue of how do we make sure that these behaviours don't just happen on the programme but continue after the programme's finished. So for us, it's very much about understanding this model in depth, and that by going into the emotional, looking at the emotional side of it, most senior leaders, because of the environments they're often in, won't do that in the workplace, and Ruth's going to come on to that in a moment. And just out of interest, there's a very good book that's literally just come out, a Kogan Page, published not probably about a few weeks ago, called how the workplace impacts on that. It's called The Fear-Free Organisation by Paul Brown and a couple of others. And it very much focuses on how the senior teams, through their own behaviours and lack of emotional literacy often generate a culture where there is a lot of fear and anxiety, and doesn't allow people to engage at that emotional level. And so if we can engage senior leaders in an outdoor environment, create that safe psychological space, then it's going to enable them to understand that more and enable you as L&D leaders to then roll that out across the organisation. So I'm going to leave that there for now. So the link will be there so you can go and look at that in more detail, but I think it's quite interesting to understand this model as we move on. So Ruth, I'll hand back over to you to go on to the next section.
Brilliant, thanks Neil. So what I'd like to do is build upon the integrated performance model that you've just talked through there, by looking at that physiology layer in a little bit more detail. And many people will know that the brain evolved as a series of overlapping structures, and you can see on the screen in front of you a very crude diagram of the development of the brain in the 3 different areas. But essentially the different parts of the brain don't operate independently of one another. So they've established numerous interconnections through which they influence one another, and that can sometimes cause real complications, and particularly when we're working with people to help them develop. Actually, those interactions between the different parts of the brain can help or hinder their development. So I just wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time exploring that. So the first part of the brain, or the old brain, is known as the reptilian brain, and this is really the area that controls our autonomic functions. So it's keeping us alive, essentially, heart rate, breathing, body temperature, and balance, and so on. And then the next part of the brain that evolved from there is the limbic brain, which is also known as the middle brain. And you can see on the diagram there, you've also got the amygdala that's been labelled, and that's part of the limbic brain. So essentially, this part of the brain is responsible for emotions in humans. And the main structures are the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. But basically, it's where we make judgments, often unconsciously, that will exert a strong influence on our behaviour. So this is really important because actually, if people are in a learning environment where they're feeling threatened, their fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain will kick in, which is in this limbic brain, and may actually stop them from being able to engage with the learning. The neocortex, then, the new brain, this is the area that's responsible for abstract thought, reason, imagination, consciousness. And actually, sometimes what we see is the interaction between the neocortex, the new brain, and the old brain can cause tension or difficulty, where perhaps we've had a response to a situation where we perceive there to be a threat. And then that threat moves on, but actually our new brain continues to imagine that, is able to reason about it and think about it, which means that we're not actually able to move on from the threat, and we stay in that threatened psychological space, which will inevitably influence our behaviours and how we're interacting with people, with the organisations, with the development programme, and so on. So actually, the neuroscience is really important, and when working with people on any kind of development programme, either indoors or outdoors, different people are going to respond in different ways, and it's really important to understand how this is going to influence people's responses to different experiences. And so just to build upon that, I want to touch upon comfort zones and psychological safety, because when we're working in the outdoors, we often find that people have one of 2 very different kind of responses. There are those people who feel fearful or threatened by coming into the outdoor environment because they have a perception that they're going to be asked to do something which will frighten them. And I think that goes back to those negative perceptions that Neil talked about earlier on, around, am I going to be asked to get wet and muddy for the sake of it? Am I going to be frightened at the top of a high ropes course for no apparent reason? So actually, we're dealing with people who go into that threat brain because of some of the physical things that they're going to be asked to do. Equally, when we're working in the outdoors, we can find that people feel safer psychologically than they do when they're back in the workplace, because there may be anchors to negative patterns of behaviour or normal ways of behaving and working which are really getting in the way. And taking people out of that environment where those negative anchors exist can be really freeing, liberating, and to help them go into a much safer psychological space where they're more able to reflect deeply and to think about things in a way that allows them to make significant behavioural change. So thinking about comfort zones is really important. So in terms of the the basic premise of this model, it is that in the middle there we've got our comfort zone. Most people spend 90% of their time in the comfort zone. And what we find is that it's easy for people to stay in their comfort zone if you stick them in a classroom. Obviously, this depends on the quality of the facilitator, but essentially, if we've got people in an environment which doesn't challenge them, is not different to one that they're used to, it's possible for them to be passengers and to not have to stretch or challenge themselves in any way. So the challenge then is about taking people into that next zone, the stretch or learning zone, where they're going to grow and develop, but critically not taking them beyond that, because that's when they're going to shut down. So if you think about the different parts of the brain, going back to that previous slide, what happens when people are in the stretch zone is that dopamine is produced. And this is the brain chemical that's responsible for drive, excitement, action. It's a really positive chemical to help people learn and do things differently. When people step out of that zone into the danger zone, a different chemical called cortisol is produced. And this actually damages people's ability to think clearly. It's often called the stupid drug. So essentially, we've gone back to that early fight, flight, or freeze response, and it's absolutely not possible for people to learn or develop in that kind of state. Back in the middle there, in the comfort zone, we're looking more at the chemical oxytocin, which is more associated with kind of a sense of calmness and belonging and peace. And so actually that's a really important area for people to spend time in as well. It's tiring to go out into that stretch zone. So what we're looking for in outdoor programs that we design and deliver is to give people the opportunity to move between safe and stretch. And if they do go into that panic or danger zone, how quickly can we bring them back into the safe zone? So the emotions and the feelings that they generate directly impact on our cognitive ability and our ability to learn. And the environment very much does help and hinder that process. And it's down to us as practitioners to really think about how we design something and how we pay attention to people's different responses to make sure that that's done in the best possible way. And this next slide is all looking at something called the affect regulator system, which is essentially the fact that the brain has got 3 different motivational systems, if you like. And you can see on the screen there that we've got, it's almost another way of representing the comfort zones. So we've got down at the bottom there, the threat-focused area, the place where people feel anger, anxiety, disgust. You've then got the safe zone up in the right-hand corner, where it's soothing, it's safeness, it's kindness. And across on the top left-hand side, this is more about wanting to pursue, to achieve, to be active. And the secret of designing a really effective program is to allow people to move between those 2 at the top, the drive and excitement and the content and safe area. And from our experience, outdoor environments allow us to create a space where people can move between that comfort and stretch zone, because it's not about creating frightening situations and experiences that push people into panic. So that whole perception around let's get muddy for the sake of it, let's do a high ropes course because it's going to be good for people. Actually, no, we need to be thinking about how do we use this environment in a way that's going to be really effective. What I'd like to then talk about, though, is why the outdoor environment is so good for helping people to move between those 2 very positive areas of being safe and content, and then also being driven and moving forward. And this then moves us on to an area around attention. So if we start by looking at attention, essentially human beings have 2 different kinds of attention, what's known as direct or directed and involuntary. So directed attention is crucial to many areas of our life. Short-term memory, focus, it helps us to suppress distraction, it makes us good at focusing on detail. So for those of us who found school easy or were successful at school, probably we were good at the directed attention side of our brain. The other type of attention is involuntary attention. So that's when our attention is captured by something intriguing or important. So a good example of that would be if you're crossing the road and you don't see a car and they blow their horn, actually it grabs your attention because you actually need to do something then to avoid being hit. So the directed attention then kicks in to take action to avoid being hit, but it's the involuntary attention that has been grabbed by the blowing of the horn. So why is this important? Well, Stephen and Rachel Kaplan spent a lot of time researching into how this whole area of attention works in the natural environment, and they developed something called attention restoration theory. So essentially what their research shows is that our attention is captured by the features of the environment. And because the natural environment is actually quite a gentle place to be, our attention is captured by these gentle features, which mean that the requirement for the directed attention side of the brain is minimized. We're just able to be aware of the things that are going on around us, but we don't have to use that directed attention part of our brain to actually take action. So the research shows that after interaction with the natural environment, we're better able to perform directed attention tasks. So going back to the brain responses, if we can create a safe space for people to explore developmental challenges and create opportunities for stretch away from a threat environment, people are much more likely to engage with the experience, to switch off the part of their brain which might get in the way, and explore issues more deeply in a way that allows them to identify where they may need to make some significant behavioural shifts. And so, from our point of view, this is kind of almost looking at the passive aspects of the environment, that involuntary attention, the gentle features of the environment, helping people's brains to get into a place where they're more able to learn, more able to reflect, and therefore kind of reflect at a much deeper level about the things that they may need to do differently. And Neil's now going to talk to us about how we build upon that, the passive aspects of the environment, and use it in a more active way during the design of our outdoor programmes. Neil.
Thanks, Ruth. Before I go into exploring the elements of this model you've got on the screen now, I think just to sort of touch back on what Ruth was saying there, and picking up on some of those negative perceptions of the outdoor industry as a way to run sort of corporate learning and development, is that a lot of that, I'm sure, again, you've probably got some of those own negative stereotypes of problem-solving tasks. You know, get from A to B using the planks over the shark-infested custard. Well, not really. I'm in a classroom and there's carpet on the floor. It doesn't. There is an element of problem-solving in it, but a lot of the time, not enough thought has gone into why are we actually doing the task? What is this task going to teach us? Are we running a course on problem-solving, or are we doing a developmental program looking at behaviours? In which case, if it's the latter, and we want that vertical development that we talked about earlier, and that greater behavioural shift, then you've got to look at, when you are in the outdoors, what tasks and vehicles are you going to use to generate those real lived behaviours that you can then explore with the delegates. So the model you've got on the screen here then, which was developed by one of our associates, Judith Cantrell, who did her master's over in the States, and she's looking at this whole area of problem solving and complexity. And we've got a standard sort of 4-box grid here. So on the vertical axis, what we're looking at here is how well understood and how much knowledge is there around what the solution might be from known to unknown. And then across the horizontal axis, how much clarity have we got on what the problem actually is? Is it very clear what the problem is, or is it unclear? So going back to those sort of stereotypical problem-solving tasks you may well have done in your earlier careers, they were very much focused on that box one. We've got a problem, we know what the problem is, and we've got a very clear protocol to go about selecting one of the many solutions that we know that could solve this problem. Yes, it will generate some discussion and some behaviours, but because the problem is so clear and the outcome is so well known, it doesn't generate enough interaction between those people to really then pull that out in the reflective element after the task. So what we're really looking at in the way we design our programs, they're very, those box one activities are very good at, the icebreakers, starting to get people towards that safer psychological non-threatening phase where they're willing to be more open and trusting about how they're thinking, feeling, and willing to feedback to each other. So the second sorts of tasks then that can be designed are those where we know what the problem is. We've got very clarity on that, so the brief gives them a very clear problem, or it's very visually clear. However, the solution isn't, or we don't know which solution to go for yet. There's going to be more discussion needed to identify which is the most appropriate route to take. So this is very much more than about managing the team and the behaviours and communication that go on to manage the individuals in the team. Looking at developing tools for creative thinking, with different ways of brainstorming, mind mapping, scenario planning, all those sorts of things. Evaluating options, how they plan and allocate resources, apply a plan, all those sorts of things. So that's sort of moving us up the spectrum. And then in that sort of bottom right-hand corner, then box 3, this is where we're very much getting into the sort of having to analyze and explore. So this is we don't even know what the problem is yet, so we can't solve it. it's likely that once we've worked out what the problem is, that will open up a whole series of obvious solutions that we can select from. But by designing problems where the tasks and problem-solving tasks with more complexity, if you can make the problem clear, that then leads to generating, deliberately generating ambiguity in the problem. We don't know what we don't know, and so we can't move forward. So that's about then helping, groups of people, whether they're in TAC teams or not, or whether this is, helping leaders explore the behaviours that they're going to need in these sort of environments. So this is about, refocusing on developing and finding out what their areas of expertise are, willing to accept that they might not be able to come up with a clear understanding of the problem themselves. Trying to manage and transform the data that they've got to try and get some more clarity. Sharing and developing ideas together, being willing to be vulnerable and accepting that they can't come up with what the problem is themselves. And trying to sort of pursue an analytical approach with a lot more rigor and more resilience. So it becomes more complicated. There's no obvious links as there are in, say, box 1. And then the final one, then, which is where we can really get some really deeper insights into the behavioural side, is creating problems and tasks and activities that are, these are the ones where the people are going to be saying, we don't even know what we're facing. We're doing something completely new. We have no clarity. We don't even know what the problem is. We don't know where to start. And we've got a good sense that even if we get some clarity on that, we're going to be starting from scratch and trying to come up with a solution. So this is very much about, this isn't linear, ordered thinking. This is very much, taking a holistic approach. The relationships have to be more intense and people being willing to be more open, getting more insight from each other. Looking at creating more questioning environments, and where things are so complex, things are sort of very intertwined, they almost only make sense in hindsight, and being willing to, this is the area for us where, going back to Ruth's comfort zones and the regulatory system that she described earlier, this is where we're trying to get leaders to, on our programs, to look at those really wicked, complex problems that come up in the business. And if we can get them in that understanding how to get to that safe brain, non-threatening psychological mode, that's where the creativity and innovation comes up, and new ways of thinking that's likely to tap into this area of problem solving. So this whole thing for us then, just to sort of sum this up, Ruth, if you could just click on, is for us, this is where the natural environment really comes into its own over and above the classroom or the indoor environment, because it just provides us with a much broader spectrum of opportunities to create some really real-life tasks and activities. And I think the thing for us then is also, as well as designing them so that they're progressive, any problem-solving activities, progressive in terms of complexity, it's also about, they then generate real lived behaviours, which then as observers, we're able to then play back to the delegates and really get them to look into and reflect on in more depth, either for themselves or with each other, the perceptions of how they came across, and get them to then use the other skills that we can then give them more from the learning side about, whether that's building relationships, rapport, communication styles, listening, all those sort of skills that we can build into the program, and in a way that they feel safe to explore them and experiment. We often use the term sort of rehearsing for reality. So if we can create that safe and psychological space, they're more likely to try those behaviours on for size, and hence they're more likely to stick long term. So that's how we sort of approach the problem solving side of working in the outdoors and what that can achieve. So back over to then looking at some of our examples of that. So I'll take this first one, then Ruth's going to talk about our recent Morocco research expedition. These photos on the screen here were from a program that finished just a couple of months ago. This was a series of 50 senior leaders in a FTSE 250 organisation. So again, getting away from the idea that you can't take, we couldn't possibly take our senior leaders out of the business and put them in a outdoor environment. this very much was that case. This was a 2-day module of a 5-module program looking at leadership behaviours, raising their conscious awareness, all that type of thing that we've been discussing earlier on the webinar. And as you can see here, the tasks were, a lot of these tasks were from that box one. They were fairly simple problems. They had to create their lunch, they had to light a fire, they had to learn that, share those skills, they had to create their food, they had to create their classroom. So we spent about 3 hours in this environment. But what we spent most of the time doing once they'd done the actual activity was then exploring what was going on through that activity. So the photo top center, that's them doing a sort of speed dating perception exercise where they were in the moment feeding back to each other in sort of 2-minute bursts with everybody in the group how they thought the other person came across to them during that activity. We've got a couple of guys there doing some reflective writing exercises around their own self-perception and how they came across what they were trying to achieve in that task. And the feedback from this particular program, from the observer, the sort of sponsor in the organization, was, some of these guys had worked together for 10 years plus, and they'd never seen them talk to each other in that degree of openness and honesty before. And certainly from the fact that we're involved with the organisation still, is that those behaviours have very much started to stick in the organisation, and those relationships have been much strengthened by the experience they had in this environment, because it was that safe psychological space. As you can see, I know certainly from my own personal preferences, that view there on a great day in those woods was much better than trying to achieve the same outcome if we'd had spent 3 hours in a hotel function suite. So there's a real sort of concrete example of how it can work, and the sorts of things you can do, which aren't just about doing an assault course or going up on a high ropes course. Okay, Ruth, over to you and Morocco.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So we've mentioned Morocco a couple of times, and actually we took a group of delegates who were all in senior leadership positions from non-competing organisations to Morocco for a week at the end of April this year. For us, it was a research expedition. We wanted to really explore how that environment would impact on people's learning, and the aim was to help them focus on their development by creating an environment where they were completely disconnected from their normal work and distractions. And the focus in terms of what we did with them during their trekking, which was in the Anti-Atlas, was a series of kind of one-to-one coaching sessions whilst walking and also whilst at the campsite, along with group discussion in the evenings. We were trekking for 4 days. We had a couple of days travel within the country, and at all times we were really encouraging that open discussion and coaching between the delegates as well as with ourselves. And the feedback from each delegate is that this kind of remote experience in the wilderness allowed for a much deeper, more reflective experience, which challenged them, raised their consciousness, and kind of created the mirror for them to examine their own behaviours in. There was no content input. So during discussions, people referred to useful models and tools and books, but essentially it was a reflective experience which was designed to allow people that time and space to reflect, to be challenged by each other so that they could really think about what behavioural shifts they may need to make as senior leaders. One of the leaders at the end of it, during her kind of end of expedition interview, commented that she'd never approached leadership development or her own development in that kind of environment before, but that actually now she wouldn't want to do it in any other environment. And we had some representatives from some really interesting businesses within there. We had people from EDF Energy, from Sony, so some businesses which lead the way in many ways around leadership development, and getting their feedback and input from that was really valuable. And going back to the CIPD research that Neil referenced at the beginning, and particularly that point about businesses not recognising the value of learning and development, I think what we've really learned in this situation is by actually forcing the issue and taking these senior leaders into the outdoors, rather than allowing them to say, I haven't got time, we need to do a kind of shortened version in the boardroom. Actually, as soon as they had that personal experience of the level of impact that this kind of experience can have, they suddenly changed their point of view about the power of development programs. And that's been a really significant learn for us. And we're going to be writing up our research and publishing a research paper about that experience to share as well, because the feedback was so positive and really helped to kind of open people's eyes to the impact of that kind of learning experience.
Ruth, can I just add a point in there as well?
Yeah, of course.
From a practitioner's point of view, I mentioned at the start my sort of research into coaching and the impact of the environment on coaching. And again, one of the big growth areas of in-house delivery over the coming years from the CIPD survey is around the growth of in-house coaching cultures and the use of peers as coaches and mentors. And I think one of the really interesting things for me that I explored in that research was about the role of coaching and walking. And it's increasingly being used in small pockets by external coaches largely. But interestingly, the feedback from all the people that I researched and spoke to, some very sort of well-respected coaches in the industry, all of them have sort of said, I'd love to do some coaching whilst walking. I just don't feel, it's almost sort of brave enough to suggest it because the client will typically, it's more convenient for them to do it in their office. It doesn't cost any more time or money. Yet, interestingly, from a practitioner's point of view, having trialed this coaching whilst walking in Morocco, and the feedback from the delegates was, some of these guys were having a coaching, quite intense coaching session for, sometimes up to 3 hours or more whilst we were trekking during the day. Yet it didn't feel like that at all, and didn't have any of the sort of, as Ruth mentioned before, the negative anchors of coaching in the workplace. And whilst we're not advocating that all coaching takes place on expeditions in Morocco, it certainly can be replicated in business. If you're a business that's got a campus, can you go and walk outside? Can you walk the corridors? Whatever it might be, but actually that sensation of walking shoulder to shoulder, not face to face. There's lots of sort of physical, sort of somatic things that come out of that process of sort of sharing the experience and sharing the problem and sort of future facing. So I think that sort of coaching thing and walking is another area that needs a whole load of research and evidencing as to the benefits of spending more time coaching outdoors rather than indoors.
Brilliant, thanks Neil. So just as we draw the webinar to a conclusion then, just to finish on some tips really from our experience and from the research we've done when you are considering designing or developing an outdoor programme. We've made the point a couple of times, but the fact that place really does provide the glue between the reflective experience and raising consciousness. And as we've said, we see those three areas as being absolutely crucial to the design and delivery of an effective development programme. The only way that you're going to get people to raise their consciousness is to create the opportunity for reflective experience. And actually the environment has a huge impact on whether people are in a psychological space to be able to do that. And we're going to be writing up our findings in a white paper on that as well, which we'd be very happy to share with people. But moving on from that, if you think again about the venues that you use, as we've already said, office-based training rooms often don't help create behavioural shift because people will have associations with those spaces. They may be negative, they may be about specific ways of behaving, communicating, real anchors to certain ways of doing things that are not going to help your leaders to think about things differently, to challenge themselves, to get into a space where they're able to really reflect on their own behaviour and impact. Also, challenge yourself to step outside your comfort zone. Outside doesn't have to mean roughing it, and I think we need to throw that perception away now of the let's get muddy for the sake of it. Of course, there are still places out there that you can do that, but actually it's really possible to create an outdoor experience which is much more about that reflective experience in an outdoor space. And as the point I made about the Morocco experience, so often senior leaders in particular will say, we don't have the time for this, please can you do a shortened version for us for 2 hours in the boardroom. And actually be prepared to challenge them to step outside their comfort zones, because they aren't going to get the outcomes that you need staying in the boardroom for 2 hours. And actually, if they do have that personal experience outside, the difference will be enormous. And the research that we've done in Morocco really backs that up. I think also don't be restricted by what the venue offers. Do start with a blank sheet of paper. What we sometimes find is that people will go to a venue, they'll see that there's a high ropes course, there's an assault course, and they'll feel compelled to use those things. Try not to. Actually, unless you can answer the question, why are we using this? What's the purpose? What outcome do we want to achieve by using this task? Then you shouldn't be using it. And so often we see people who have decided to use a high ropes course because it's there and they hope that the learning will be implied, but actually it really doesn't deliver the outcomes that they need to deliver. And then finally, tune into or pay attention to the different reactions that people are having to their environment so that you can help them to move into that safe psychological space. And people will have different triggers, different boundaries, and it's really important as a skilled facilitator to be able to notice what's going on. And that's true for whether you're in the classroom or in an outdoor environment. So Neil, I'm going to hand over to you to sort of do our final conclusions before we see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously been a lot of content there. We're conscious of that, and a virtual environment hasn't probably necessarily created the best place to try and get through all that detail. But just to sort of try and pull out some of the key points for us that we're trying to get across is, actually, if you can try and move away from some of those older negative stereotypes of what the outdoors is all about, the fun team, away days, then that's a great thing. Because although it can absolutely deliver all of that in spades, it's actually a genuine and a serious high-impact development tool. And we probably use the outdoors more at senior level than we do at junior level. Because if you want to really tackle those behavioural issues at a senior level and create that lasting developmental change, then you've got to create those learning spaces where they're willing to engage at that level. And the natural environment really helps to do that. In creating those outdoor classrooms, as Ruth was saying, be creative about the spaces that you've got. Look at them in a different way. If you've got your own academy spaces or venues that you use, what outdoor spaces are there? Could you create some outdoor classrooms? Going back to the thing I mentioned at the beginning, go and visit your local primary school who are running a forest school and see what spaces they're using and try and glean some ideas from that as to what outdoor spaces and classrooms could we create at very little cost or in the venues that we use. There's so much that's possible and portable. And as Ruth said, I think it does come back to that pushing the boundaries with senior leaders. Don't reserve this natural environment using the outdoors for, let's go and put them through a difficult sort of fearful environment, because it'll be character building. This isn't about building character. It isn't about pushing people into that panic and fear zone. It's about enabling people to, as Ruth was saying, sort of press the pause button from their 24/7 permanently connected responsive lives, and get out to into some spaces where they can generally sort of reconnect with themselves, have conversations with each other if they're an intact senior team that probably wouldn't happen in an indoor classroom environment. And it's that process that genuinely then creates those deeper personal insights, going back to that coherence model we mentioned at the beginning, that vertical development where they're getting that deeper personal insight around what their emotions and feelings are. I bet if you ask most of your leaders to sort of name the emotions that they'd gone through in the last week, the better ones might come up with 12, given that there are only sort of 8 basic emotions and all the others are combinations of that. Yet there are about 3,500 words in the English dictionary that describe emotions. So raising that, broadening that emotional literacy for senior leaders is a really important tool to then changing their way of thinking and behaving and driving cultural change in the organisation. And I think the outdoors has a massive role to play in driving that agenda in organisations. So there's been a lot there. So I know we had some questions as people registered, and I know Ruth, you'll have been paying attention as we went through. People have been raising things as we went along.
Yes, indeed. So a couple of people have asked for the name of the book that you mentioned. So we're going to email that book title and author out afterwards so that you've all got that to refer to. And a couple of people have also asked for the Morocco learnings, and we're writing up a research paper and case study, and we'll be happy to share that as well. One question that has come in is around how do we find the right outdoor space or activity to suit a diverse team? What are our best practice recommendations? And I think from my point of view, one of the first things that needs to happen is a really good needs analysis. What we tend to find is when we're designing any kind of leadership program or a team program, actually having one-to-one conversations with people in that delegate group prior to even putting pen to paper in terms of design is so important in helping us to understand what their needs are. And it means that then when we do set about looking for a venue or planning what activities we might use, we've got that really clear focus on the different needs that are within the group. Neil, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, in terms of, how do you find one that's appropriate for diverse groups? I think it's the case that actually the benefit of the outdoor environment is that in a lot of cases, you can design your own space. You're not constricted by being in a hotel environment where you've got the four walls and the windows are where they are and the whiteboards where it is and everything else. You can just, through that needs analysis, you can assess the group, you can see what their needs are, how they're going to react, and you can design your own space. And it's a space that, or as we often do, get them to create their own space. Yes, it does take a bit of time and effort and energy to go out there and be a bit more creative in terms of finding venues. And that's certainly one of the areas that we spend a lot of time doing before any program is looking at, the geographical spread of the delegates, where would be the best place to deliver it, and then actually going and finding a venue that, can operate the way we want to. And I think that's, an important part of it. You've got to spend time going out, not just getting the closest or the cheapest. It's actually, will it deliver what we need it to deliver?
Great, thanks, Neil. I think time for one more question because I'm conscious we're up to the hour. One question here about how do you convince a cynical CEO of the benefits? And I think the age-old challenge of people in those senior leadership positions feeling that they haven't got the time to invest themselves in something like this, but they're happy for other people who are lower down the organisation, or perhaps they're not. Perhaps they feel as well that they can't see the benefits. And I think from our point of view, it's about being willing to push and challenge and spend some time explaining why this kind of experience is so necessary and why it can't be achieved in a classroom environment. And in many ways, that's why we invited the senior leaders that we did on the Morocco experience to really push and challenge them so that they could come back and share their experiences. Because particularly, I think with CEOs, quite often they want to hear it from somebody else who's been and had that kind of experience. Neil, is there anything else you'd like to add to that at all?
Just to echo one thing you said. Obviously from the Morocco experience, we had an assistant CEO and a CEO who were on that. And I know certainly from both of their feedback, it was the most impactful bit of development work they'd done in their 20, 30 years careers. Now, not all of their organisation are going to be able to go through the experience they had, but I think, as you said, it certainly opened their eyes up to this idea of reflective experience and the benefit of that, and taking a more behavioural approach to senior leadership development and getting away from the learning and let's just give them more skills, content, knowledge, experience, and actually let's genuinely explore. I think if you can show them the benefits of that, whilst you might not be able to put the ROI in pounds, shillings and pence on the bottom of a P&L, I think if they've had that, if you can get the senior leaders to have their own personal experience of it, it's much easier then to sort of justify the value and the ROI for then more junior programs because they've had the experience themselves. They know what they got out of it.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. Conscious of time, so we're going to finish the webinar there. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar with you guys in case you want to go back through it in your own time and look at any of the slides. And please do give us a call if there's anything that you feel you'd like to talk about in more detail, or if there's any more information you'd like us to share with you. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it useful and look forward to speaking to you at some point.